Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Passaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined from the UK by Aurelien Mondon, who is a lecturer at the University of Bath, as well as the co-author of Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream, and also the co-editor of the recent book, The Ethics of Researching the Far Right. Thanks for joining us, Aurelien.
Thanks for having me on the show.
I guess just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in researching the far right?
I was always kind of interested in far-right politics and in kind of combating far-right politics. However, I grew up in France, and as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners know, France has a kind of weird idea about anti-racism and what anti-racism is, because, you know, in the French kind of like psyche, there's this idea that France cannot be racist and the French Republic cannot be racist. Therefore, you know, just kind of like abiding by Republican ideals is enough to be anti-racist. So I grew up in this context, and the first time I voted was in 2002, and that's when Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the then Front National far-right party, got to the second round of the election, and then that triggered huge waves of demonstrations. And, you know, I was a student at the time, so I was in the streets, and, you know, that kind of like, in a way, made me even more aware of his politics. And then I had the opportunity to travel, to come to Australia in particular, to do some studies as well on exchange. And that's when I kind of realized that my understanding of far-right politics in France, of racism and all that, was a bit skewed. And so that kind of opened a lot of kind of avenues for me to think about. And that led to me having the opportunity again to do a PhD, to engage with various ideas on race, racism, critical race theory. And that led me to kind of think that actually the problem with the far right wasn't just the far right in a way, even though that was my original interest and my original focus. Very quickly, I turned to actually studying the mainstream and the role of mainstream actors and mainstream elites in the rise of the far right and in enabling far right politics. And yeah, so that's where it led me to where I am today, to actually focus more and more on mainstream politics and the way reactionary politics are very much core to mainstream elites' projects.
That topic is one that you look at in the book, Reactionary Democracy. We recently spoke to your co-author, Aaron Winter, about it. The book's been out for a little while now. We've just had the EU elections. I assume that people took on a lot of the lessons from the book. There's not been too much mainstreaming of the far right, I'd hope.
No, not at all. And actually, as I'm sure you know, the far right has done horribly, and actually now we're back into that lovely state of liberal bliss. So it's great. It's all very good. I mean, more seriously, though, it's incredibly frustrating, to be honest, to see that the book came out in 2020, so it was written probably in 2018-19. And yeah, no lessons have been learned. And, you know, it is frustrating in a way, because, you know, we don't want to say, I told you so, we told you so, but it does feel like that. And I think a lot of the things that we talked about in the book are still very relevant. Having said that, though, even though the book wasn't a particularly optimistic one, and, you know, we did try in the final chapter to kind of find ways forward, to find more optimistic ways to kind of look at the situation and what was developing in terms of resistance and countering far-right politics, we weren't particularly optimistic. And yet, I think things have got a lot worse than we expected, a lot more quickly. And I think that's one of the lessons that I think we both took from the last 4 or 5 years since we wrote the book is that things have accelerated. And we saw that in the EU elections, not just in the rise of the far right, because I think it hasn't risen as much as people have said it had. And as much as, again, the mainstream kind of discourse has said it had, but also in the acceptance of far-right politics as just part of the norm now and, maybe worth experimenting with and worth giving them a shot, a shot at governing. And I think this is incredibly scary to see how acceptable far and extreme right politics have become now as just part of the political landscape in many Western countries and beyond, and how in fact the left now has become the boogeyman, right? We saw that with Kylian Mbappe. I think it was yesterday who said that he encouraged French people to vote against the extremes, using that good old horseshoe theory to say that the extreme right, the Rassemblement National, Éric Zemmour's party, are just as bad as the kind of social democrats, and that we need to vote for Macron, who really has been hugely responsible for the state of politics in France today.
There's been a coalition of opposition parties formed in France to try and stop Le Pen and others from assuming government. Do you think that this is a promising development, or is it too little too late?
Bit of both, to be honest. It is too little too late, and I wish this had happened before. Unfortunately, egos were too big to allow this to happen. And I think, Mélenchon holds a particular responsibility here, but I think the others do as well. It's not just Mélenchon. I think it's various people on the left who haven't helped with this. But I think it's still promising, again, despite the egos who are really doing a lot of damage at the moment in France, doing some infighting at a time when you need unity. I think there is promise, and I think, we're seeing something rise in difficult circumstances, because as I said before, there is, I think Macron has managed to convince a lot of people and a lot of media elites in particular that the left is a threat, and that the left is a threat just as big as the far and extreme right. And so I think, they are not in a very good environment to fight the far right. But I think, we've seen some promising signs. People are fed up. The far right is not as popular as it is said to be. But I think what will be very important in a way is not so much whether the union on the left will manage to win or not, but it's also what it would do with the victory if it manages to win or not. And I think that will be crucial, right? Because if, let's say, the Popular Front wins and has a prime minister, but ends up doing the same kind of politics as usual of managerial kind of sensible politics that change nothing and that don't change the situation of that French people are living in at the moment. This will just be delaying the inevitable, which is, that the far right will have its turn in power eventually. So what we need is really radical change. We need radical change, of course, in terms of economics, in terms of political policies and so on. But we also need a massive change in discourse. We need to take the steam away from far right issues. We need to focus on the issues that people really care about, which is away from immigration and towards more social justice.
Aurelien, the far right might not be as popular as they appear to be from some of the media reportage, but populism is certainly a popular phrase that is applied to them. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the way that populism as a term is used to whitewash some of these groups. Just by way of example, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, their victory in the EU elections was greeted with much mirth and celebration by Sky News here in Australia, Rupert Murdoch's Sky News. It seems strange to me because they're called a populist group, but they are white supremacist. They're chock full of neo-Nazis, but it seems you can whack the label populist on and it's all right.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, another huge frustration, right? Many of us, many scholars have argued and activists and researchers beyond, academic walls have argued that populism is really an unhelpful term to understand the rise of the far right and the resurgence of fascism. It's been argued many, many times. It's been shown, by any kind of serious definition of a concept, it doesn't apply to the far right. And if it does, it only applies really on the margins. It doesn't doesn't really tell us much about the politics of these movements. But it's played a massive role in legitimizing these parties by legitimizing them, which is, instead of calling them far right, fascist, racist, white supremacist, and so on, terms that are far more precise, far more accurate. But also far more stigmatizing. We call them populist, which is, a bit of a wishy-washy term, which makes them sound like they are on the side of the people, that they're against the elite, and so on. So it legitimizes them this way by euphemizing their politics, but also by linking them to the people. And this is wrong in a number of ways, right? First, far-right politics are incredibly elitist. I mean, you don't have to look far at into their programs to realize that actually a lot of their policies are very much in favor of the elite. Think about the people who have been called populists in recent years. Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is, for lower tax, is for really the kind of wealthiest people. This is fairly obvious. Think about Nigel Farage in the UK, again, incredibly elitist. Think about, the Le Pens and so on. These people are not on the side of the people. Of course they are saying they are, but, we shouldn't take them at their word. What is really absolutely fascinating, I think, about the kind of populist hype that has developed in mainstream media in mainstream politics in general to describe these parties is that it was Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father in the early 1990s, who tried to force the term populism into public discourse to describe the then Front National, which was generally described as extreme right, as coming from fascism and so on. And he was really keen on having the party called Populism. It was then taken up by some academics who then legitimized the use of the term. And now that's the one we have, So instead of calling, the AfD, as you said, far right, extreme right, or even fascist, we call them populist and make them sound like they're actually speaking for the left behind, for the, so-called white working class and so on, which again has been debunked massively. These parties are elitist. Their programs are elitist. And I think, we need to really counter these narratives, but unfortunately, it often seems like a lost battle. Again, we had, I think it was today, we had a big headline in The Guardian in the UK about Farage being a populist or the Reform Party being populist, and it's absolutely appalling.
Those academics who popularized populism could have used as a book on the ethics of researching the far right, I think. Could you tell us a little bit about the impetus for putting that book together?
Yeah, look, that was a very exciting project, and of course I would say that, but I'm very happy with the way it turned out. The impetus for that project came from, it's kind of a nice little story as well. It came from Megan Tinsley, who is one of the co-editors, tweeted at Aaron and me and maybe a few other people about whether there was any research on the ethics of researching the far right, and that kind of triggered an exchange. And at the time, I had a PhD student, Antonia Vaughan, who was actually looking into the fact that there is very little about the ethics of researching the far right. And so that became part of her PhD research. And so we decided to build on a kind of loose network of talks that we had created during the COVID era to develop this kind of book. And at first we were thinking about doing something quite academic, but then we realized that actually there was a lot of interest. There were a lot of people who wanted to contribute very interesting stuff. And we had so many chapters that we decided to change that. And instead of having kind of the traditional format for an academic book, we decided to actually have shorter reflection pieces. So we didn't want massive lit reviews. We didn't want kind of massive methodological sections or whatever. What we wanted really was people to engage with the issues they've been grappling with over the years and decades sometimes. And so it led us to have a really nice and I think exciting mix of contributions from people who are more established, like myself or Aaron, for example, but also a lot of kind of early career researchers who are really kind of at the at the kind of most exciting edge of research. And I think that turned out really well. I think it's interesting, right? We have, I think, 35 or so chapters in the book, but I think we could have had 70. And since we finalized the book, so many people have kind of, told us that they wish they could have contributed. And I've come across so much interesting research in these areas as well. So who knows, there might be space for another volume of the book, but I'm really looking forward to people engaging with it and for it to become more accessible as well, because unfortunately it's quite pricey at the moment.
Aurelien, why do you think that ethics, or can you explain why ethics is such a central concern for people writing about the far right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it takes many shapes and forms. And in a way, I think that's what was particularly exciting about the book, is that we didn't see the extent to which it could go into. And, to me, I've been researching the far right as an academic, since for 15 years now, if I count it since the start of my PhD. And yet there were so many things that had never crossed my mind, things about self-care, for example, about protecting oneself, about all of these kind of things I did, but I did it in a very ad hoc manner, and I realized as well with the advent of social media, all of these kind of things, that these things have become trickier and scarier and put particular pressures, particularly on people who hold certain identities and are at the sharp end of far-right politics. And what's fascinating is we have very little about how to deal with these kind of issues in a way of self-care, of protecting oneself, protecting the researcher, protecting the communities we work with, engaging to some extent with far-right communities sometimes, what are our ethical kind of considerations there, but also protecting the communities who are at the sharp end of far-right politics. How do we disseminate our findings? What other harm we are causing by re-traumatizing the people who might be reading our work, and so on. And so that leads to a lot of kind of very, very fascinating discussions. And I think, there is what I quite enjoyed in the book is seeing in a way these researchers at various levels in their careers being quite honest about, their own trajectory, their own experience as researchers, and being quite vulnerable in this as well. And I think we need these discussions, because there's been too much in research on the far right about objectivity, about science, about being impartial, unbiased, and so on. And I think that's been at the cost of actually being open about what we're doing, which is, we should not be researching far right politics impartially, right? We can try to be, to show our methodologies and so on. But, I think if we want to research far-right politics, we have to take a stand, because not taking a stand, I think, is also taking a stand in a way. Silence is violence when you research these kind of issues. And to me, this is one of the strengths of the book. It really shows that there is no objective research on the far right, and acknowledging our own biases, acknowledging our own political positions, I think is important and is part of an ethical journey. And so yeah, I mean, look, it's very hard to define what the ethics of researching the far right are, because it takes so many shapes and forms, but we're hoping that really this book is going to be a basis to kind of really start that discussion, and that people can really engage with it in their own ways and in their own contexts.
You're listening to 3CR, 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Aurelien Mondon. But just a reminder that it is Radiothon time at 3CR. If you want to pop over to 3cr.org.au/donate and keep things like this on the air, we would really appreciate it. All right, back to Aurelien.
I did want to ask you, Aurelien, about media representations of the far right, which often depict them as being populist in nature, which is inaccurate and unhelpful, a persistent pattern of behaviour, it seems. I wonder if you have any insight into why that's the case, because on the one hand, you might think, well, this is a matter of media literacy, that those who are writing about these subjects aren't necessarily fully conversant with the meanings of the terms that they use and so on. Or it could speak to the, I guess, changing nature of the media landscape, the way in which it might encourage those forms of expression, the extent to which it's actually part of a political project which seeks to rehabilitate the far right in the interests of media owners and others. Can you, I guess, and in discussing that, what possibilities are there for change, do you think? Do you think through persistent critique that reportage may improve, or are there other measures that could be enacted that would allow for better public discussions of the far right?
Yeah, these are great questions and huge as well. I mean, media literacy, no, I don't think so anymore, to be honest. At first, I gave journalists the benefit of the doubt, and colleagues, to be honest, the benefit of the doubt. But, the arguments about the harm that the misuse of populism is doing in public discourse are very widespread now. And I don't think there's any more excuses to keep using these terms so carelessly in many ways. I mean, just anecdotally, when Katie Brown and I published an article on The Guardian's use of populism and the way it helps mainstream far-right politics. The article was published in 2021. Our media team here at the University of Bath contacted The Guardian about it and said, hey, would you guys be interested in reading this article? It's about, what's happening in The Guardian. And The Guardian at first was like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. We'd be interested in reading it. And so our media team sent them the article and they never got back to them. They just went silent. So it's like, there's, I've called out, and many of my colleagues have called out various kind of misuses of populism and so on. And, there's no reflexivity. Some of the academics who took part in the Guardian series on populism in the late 2010s have reflected upon the use of populism, and in particular the way then the Guardian used their academic credentials to push really bad kind of like takes on populism and so on. So that's promising, but this is not enough to turn the tide really. I think there are a number of things that explain populist hype. I think, a big reason of populist hype is that the far right has been very useful for the status quo over the past 2, 3, even maybe 4 decades to justify its position by contradistinction, which is, we are bad. You don't like us, but we're not as bad as the far and extreme right. We remain a bulwark against the far and extreme right. And that's the way it started at first. And that was quite convincing. If you look at France, for example, the so-called Republican Front worked really well. Jacques Chirac, who was deeply unpopular as a politician with various kind of corruption cases against him, managed to be re-elected with 82% of the vote in 2002 because he was faced with the far right in the second round. So, this was quite useful at first. It's like, yeah, you don't like us. We're horrible. We don't have any answers to the various crises that are facing you, but at least we're not the far right. But then populism eventually became, more of a term because, you needed to kind of hype that far right to make it seem less threatening. And I think, this is quite interesting in a way, the rise of the term populism as well, and linking the far right to the people, because I think that speaks to the demophobia that is very much gripping our mainstream elite. What I mean by mainstream elite, and I should explain that because I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything like this, but I take my cue from Van Dyck and the way he talks about elite, which really in a nutshell are the people who have a privileged access to shaping public discourse. So they're not people in a basement or in a dark room deciding, what world policy is going to be, but it's more like this kind of loose kind of group of people who have access to shaping public discourse. And I'm one of them as an academic, right? I'm part of this to an extent. Of course, I don't have the same power as a Guardian editor or as massive influencers on social media and so on. But I still have a role to play. And I think, this is where the hope is to some extent. To me, accountability matters, and it's not going to be enough. But I don't think we can expect, our media landscape to change. I don't think we can expect mainstream politicians to start realizing that they've been enablers of far right politics, and that what we need is radical change. That means that they might lose out, with a kind of new world that could be created if we were to really be serious about not only tackling the rise of the far right, but tackling the state of polycrisis that we're facing at the moment. So I don't think we can expect them to change, but I think what we can expect is for the people who should know better to be held accountable. And it's small and it's not enough, but I think, there is something there, because one of the things that tires me are the people who kind of like talk the talk, but, refuse to kind of walk the walk, and that upsets me. So I think, people need to now take a stand. I don't think, until the last couple of years, or few years, let's say, it was easy for people to say, it's too far away. The far right's too far away. We still need to kind of put faith in the status quo. This is not working, right? I mean, no one can seriously say that Macron is a bulwark against the far right, that Biden is a bulwark against the far right, that, genocide will not happen under their watch. We all know now that this is, this is ridiculous to kind of still hold this line. So I think, choices have to be made. I think, radical change is upon us one way or another. The far right is ready. The liberal hegemony is crumbling and has clearly shown that they would rather have the far right in power than the left in power. So I think the people who are still pretending that they have any kind of progressive bone in their body have to take a stand now or have to be held accountable.
Aurelien, this week you published in The Conversation an article about Nigel Farage, who was a populist, quote unquote, but not especially popular. Could you speak a little bit about the role that Nigel Farage plays in UK politics and is playing in this upcoming election?
Yeah, so mind-blowing, right? Like, I mean, to me, again, I've been using the word frustrating a lot in this interview, and I've been using it a lot lately, to be honest, and in the last few years. I just sound like a broken record when I talk about these things. You know, I was writing this about Farage 10 years ago in 2014 after the EU elections, where it was massively hyped. And, you know, UKIP won the European elections in 2014 with around 26% of the vote. And of course, it made all the headlines, and Farage, who the media loves putting on front pages, you know, in very kind of like positive light, you know, drinking a beer, looking like he's like part of the people and so on, smiling, laughing. They just loved it. They just lapped it up. You know, UKIP was the new threat to the establishment. You know, it was this kind of populist groundswell. The left behind were coming to kind of tell the elite in Westminster what was what. That was rubbish, of course, right? Because, you know, this was the EU elections, which are second order elections. They are elections where there is generally very low turnout because people don't care or understand what's happening in Brussels. But they're also elections that are prone to protest vote for two reasons. One is that, again, Brussels is far away, so people don't feel that it's going to have a particular impact on their day-to-day lives, the way they vote. So they just use their vote to send a message. But also because, you know, the EU elections are prone to far-right politics, which are against the EU, which are for the nation and against, therefore, this kind of more kind of like institution that can be couched as globalist or whatever kind of conspiracy theory the far-right would choose. So the EU elections should not be taken seriously when it comes to the rise of the far-right. And yet they always are. And like they were 10 years ago in 2014 and they were in 2024. So in 2014, UKIP wins with 26% of the vote. But if you look at actually turnout, UKIP gets less than 10% of the registered vote, which means that 9 out of 10 British voters, and I'm only talking about British voters, right? I'm not even talking about the people who can't vote like myself or the people who are underage or all these kind of things, right? Or not registered or badly registered, which of course, again, impacts particular communities more than others. But 10%, 9 out of 10 registered voters in the UK did not vote for UKIP. And yet, what happened after the EU elections is that it triggered this kind of discussion about, like, should we leave the EU? David Cameron promised that referendum, was re-elected in 2015, put the referendum, and the UK left the EU. It's not an argument about whether leaving the EU or not is good or bad. You know, it's neither here nor there. But what I think is fascinating is the way Farage in 2014, with 1 out of 10 voters in a second order election, managed to actually force the hand of all of the parties, who at the time, none of them were actually campaigning on leaving the EU. There was only one party it was UKIP. They got 1 out of 10 votes, and they set the agenda, which I think is insane. And again, we're seeing it now. Like, right? We had, well, of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU anymore, so they were not part of the EU elections, but I think the EU elections allowed Farage a way in because, of course, he had all his mates in various European countries who were making headlines. And so, you know, he felt as the Reform Party was going up in the polls that he would, you know, join the fight and stand as a candidate. And since then, he's been, you know, plastered in the news everywhere. And there was one poll that suggested that he could overtake the deeply unpopular Tories, and that led to, again, various front pages that led to him and his party doing a press conference, which is incredible after one opinion poll to do that. But anyway, and at the time, they didn't even have a manifesto. You know, if you went on their website at the time, their manifesto, there was a massive kind of like draft plastered across it, a watermark. So yeah, it's ridiculous. He's a construction. He's an elite construction, and you know, and we're told he's popular, but so far he's never been elected. His parties have never had MPs elected, but somehow he's the most popular person in the UK. And this means that all we talk about is immigration, and we don't talk about social care. We don't talk about the NHS. We don't talk about pensions. We don't talk about the environment. We don't talk about all these issues that would be more beneficial for the left, and that in fact are the biggest concerns of the population.
Another UK public figure that's attracted some attention recently is Count Binface, who ran for Mayor of London recently and managed to defeat Britain First. Do you think that, you know, would someone like Count Binface perhaps qualify as a populist? And do you think, do we need to rely on our intergalactic comrades to salvage something from the parliamentary system?
Yeah, I have a soft spot for campaign phase, and I thought his election campaign was really good in London, and it's weird, it's one of the only people campaigning in London, but I was like, oh, you know what, I agree with what you're saying, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? and I think, particularly the stand he was taking against the far right and all of that, I think was fascinating, because I think he plays a role to kind of show how rotten the whole system is in a way, right? How it makes no sense anymore, by the so-called ideals that democracy should hold. This just doesn't work anymore. And I think campaign phase is useful for that. But at the same time, this is not where our hope should be. I think what we need, obviously, is more kind of like stronger organizations on the left, which we don't have. There was this groundswell in 2017, in 2019, and it was incredibly exciting, to be honest. And not being a fan of Corbyn and thinking that his program, to be honest, was quite mild and quite moderate. For example, someone I think compared his program with François Mitterrand's in France in 1981. François Mitterrand, who was elected president of the Republic then, and François Mitterrand's program was far more radical than Corbyn. So it was kind of like social democracy and careful social democracy, and yet this led to kind of a lot of kind of people being politicized, people kind of throwing their hopes and dreams behind him of a slightly more slightly fairer system and fairer world. And the way Corbyn was shut down and treated and led to then the rise of Starmer, who betrayed every single promises he had made, I think has done a huge disservice to the left, and it's been a huge blow. And I think what we will need is to reorganize. And at the moment, we're not really seeing this. I mean, we're seeing the Greens making some headways, but it's not quite the same impetus that we have. And at the moment, the left, I think, is very disorganized in this country.
I know in Australia, Adam Bandt, the leader of the Australian Greens, recently described the party as a social democratic party and actually embodying the values that the Labor Party in Australia once claimed to be committed to. Do you think what we're witnessing is that, if not the death of social democracy, which has been suggested previously, then the death of Labourism in countries like Australia and the UK?
I think so, and I think it goes beyond Australia and the UK. I think we've seen it in various other countries. Again, like thinking of France, another country that I've studied a lot. We've seen that happening as well with the rise of Macron in a way, or even the election of Hollande in 2012, and I think it is dying, but it's not dying quite quickly enough, I would say. And I think what you see is that there is always attempts to revive it. And I think these attempts to revive it are probably misplaced, because the world has changed and we cannot go back to the same old recipes. What funded the welfare state in the post-war period was empires, right? So I think these kind of things will have to change. I think, we will have to think about things more transnationally, more globally, if we are to kind of revive a left-wing project. And I think people are still too stuck in their kind of national settings and national contexts, which, don't get me wrong, they are super hard to overcome because they have become so naturalized in politics. But I think if we are to have answers to the various crises we are facing at the moment, whether it's the climate crisis, obviously, but also kind of like rise of inequality, poverty, displacements, wars, the rise of the far right and fascism, and so on, we will need transnational cooperation and collaboration, and I think this is missing at the moment. And I don't think social democracy has an answer to that. I think it's looking back too much and not forward enough, to be honest.
Speaking of looking back, there have been numerous comparisons made between the period in which we find ourselves now and the, early 21st century, and the situation as it was, especially in Europe, about 100 years ago, when there was a great economic dysfunction and the emergence of a far-right movement that eventually was able to assume power in a number of countries with disastrous consequences. One of the things I've kind of thought about or grappled with in the recent years is the extent to which fascism, as part of the far right, or as, a near equivalent term, can re-emerge and become a real force that needs to be responded to seriously and which requires some form of anti-fascist activism. In terms of your own studies of the far right broadly, do you think that the fascist threat is, if not, it may have been more recognised of late, it's still not taken seriously enough in terms of it being an actual, real prospect that will signal or could signal a real change, not just in terms of the kind of, general, let's call it degeneration you'd associate with a capitalist society, but something perhaps even more catastrophic. So how do you, understand the far right in terms of the threat of fascism, and what kinds of, if social democracy is exhausted, what kinds of responses are actually possible in order to effectively combat fascism and the far right?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, really. And, I used to be one of these, academics. He used to say, we have to be careful, history never repeats itself exactly the same way, blah, blah, blah. But actually even the last few months, I've been like, yeah, actually, no, maybe it does repeat itself. Kind of like, with some of the things that we are seeing happening at the moment, it's just incredibly reminiscent of what happened in the not just in the 1920s and 30s, but even, at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the rise of the resurgence of anti-Semitism, thinking about the Dreyfus Affair, for example, in France again, or in various other countries, the way kind of nationalism became increasingly violent or re-became increasingly violent, because it was always there anyway, that violence, I think, in the nationalist project. And so there's a lot of things. And of course, as you said, the economic situation, all of this. So I think there's a lot of parallels that are there. And yeah, I think I agree with you. And I don't expect it to be the same, obviously. I don't expect necessarily to see jackboots on the streets or swastikas or anything like this. But I think it is not taken seriously enough, the fact that, we are living at times where some of the things that are happening have happened before. Some of the reaction to the things that are happening are very similar to the ones that took place in the 1920s and 30s, which were like, well, like the far right is threatening, but we're still strong enough. Liberal democracy will prevail, and then then liberal democracy doesn't prevail, and then they're like, okay, we have a choice between maybe something more radical on the left or welcoming the far right into the fold and hoping to use them, and that's what we're seeing. When you see von der Leyen in the EU, for example, welcoming the far right, to kind of lead with her is, or at least accept them as part of kind of the normal process of the EU is mind-blowing to me, and I think it says a lot about the EU project as well, again, that's these kind of debates have completely polluted our politics. The Brexit referendum in the UK was completely ridiculous because we had the choice between a reactionary project for Brexit and a reactionary project with the EU. Both of these projects had barbed wires on their borders, right? Like none of them were actually progressive in any way, shape or form. And so again, it was a non-starter. And that's what we're given time and time again at these, with elections in the UK at the moment. We're given a choice between Sunak and Starmer, both terrible and reactionary options. Think about the US as well, Biden and Trump, both terrible options. In Australia, well, the situation better than I do. In France, Macron and Le Pen is what we're given, although we have the Popular Front at the moment, but we can see the efforts that are being taken to actually prevent the Popular Front for looking like a viable alternative. And I think what we see is no appetite in our mainstream elite to actually take the threat of fascism seriously or to actually take a stand against the threat of fascism. So I think some of them might take it seriously. I think many of them have accepted that Marine Le Pen will be French president at some stage. Many of them have accepted that, borders have to be barbed wired and, refugees have to be stopped and sent away to far away kind of countries. Many people have accepted that, well, genocides need to happen sometimes if it's our allies who are doing them. And I think that is particularly scary because in the 1920s and 30s, we had a strong left-wing movement. We had kind of, they were not necessarily anti-fascist movements at the time because fascism wasn't, necessarily named, but we had strong kind of counter movements against the far right and against the rise of the far right. And at the moment, we don't have them, I think. I mean, we have them on the ground and we have, grassroots movements and things like that. But compared to what we're facing, it seems that we are badly prepared in many ways. And again, I really want to stress that I don't want to kind of, underestimate the work that's been done by various anti-fascist groups, anti-racist groups, pro-trans rights groups, and so on against the rise of reaction and the rise of fascism. But we are facing like a really monumental force, I think, and a coalition that is growing between the far right / fascism and the liberal center, who would rather have a fascist future than its privilege threatened. And to me, that is worrying. And I think it's going to be a tough battle.
I don't have a question. It just reminded me of something Chomsky once observed of his childhood growing up in the 30s, and about how it was a desperate time. Many were impoverished, but there was a sense of hope because there were efforts to organise and a lot of activity, mass activity taking place. It was difficult, but he was sustained by, and his reflection records that there were institutions, movements comprising many people who were very active and very determined. And I think he also supplemented that observation, which was made a few years ago, with noting the relative absence of that in the US political scene at the time. And that was one of the major causes he had for his concerns about the future. It was not just, desperate times, but the absence of movements and organisations that were able and willing to address and to seek redress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And I think, we see moments where these things kind of like bubble almost. And, so that's where I think the hope is. And I think, where I find hope as well is that all of this is contingent, right? It doesn't have to be this way. It hasn't always been this way. We've had these movements before, despite their faults and all of these kind of things, And I do still believe that, these movements could be popular, far more popular than the far right has ever been, and far more popular even than the liberal hegemony has become. But I think, we need better organizing, we need better thinking, we need better kind of connections between these movements. But it is contingent. So I think, there's hope, I guess. Maybe a better place to stop to finish the podcast.
I think we need the lazy determination of the cat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Aurelien, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. If people want to find you online, you are on x.com at Aurelien Mondon. And of course, the books Reactionary Democracy and The Ethics of Researching the Far Right are out now. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Well, Andy, that is our show. We'll be back next week. But just a reminder to our listeners that we are currently fundraising for the 3CR Radiothon. People can go to 3cr.org.au/donate. or givenow.com.au/CR/Yan Arpasaran. Donate to our crowdraiser. We would really appreciate it because it keeps stuff like this on the air.
True. And thank you so much to those people who have donated.
Yes, we will have a full accounting in due course.
See you next week.
Just needs this helping hand. And if young Nigel says he's happy, he must be happy, he must be happy, he must be happy in his work. We only make it plans for Nigel. He has his future in the British Steel. We're only making plans for Nigel. Nigel's whole future is as good as steel. And if young Nigel says he's happy, he must be happy.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
To donate, call 03 9419 8377 or donate online at 3cr.org.au.